Let me tell you what nobody tells you about chasing your dream. It doesn't pay rent, and I mean that literally, not metaphorically. I know that sounds obvious, but knowing something and living it are two completely different things when you're 26, eating noodles at midnight. My name is Kai, and before everything went sideways and then somehow came back around, I was a voice director for a small anime dubbing studio. Not a big one. Not the kind with glass offices and people whose names appear in credits of things anyone has actually seen. I'm talking about a studio in a converted apartment that smelled like old carpet and recording foam and someone's forgotten coffee from 2 days ago. 3 microphones, 1 soundproofed closet, a rotating cast of voice actors who did this for the same reason I did. They physically could not stop themselves. We dubbed B-tier anime for streaming platforms that paid us just enough to keep the lights on. Not $1 more. And I loved every single second of it. That's the part that's hard to explain to people who have never done creative work seriously. There is a specific feeling when a scene locks in, when the voice, the timing, the breath between lines all click into place with the animation like a key in the exact right lock. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it just fits. And when it fits, there is nothing else in the world that feels exactly like that. I chased that feeling every single day for 4 years. My family thought I had lost my mind somewhere around year 2. My father called every Sunday, same time, 7 p.m., same opening line without variation. Kai, I talked to Uncle Deho. He has a position in logistics. And I would say, Dad, I'm good. And he would say, you're not good. You're eating noodles at midnight. I can hear the microwave. He could always hear the microwave. I do not know how. The man had ears like a retired military dog, but he always knew. My mother's approach was different. She didn't push. She did something worse. She sent care packages every 2 weeks without fail. Rice, dried seaweed, good soy sauce, the expensive kind, with a note that said things like, "We just want you to be healthy." And then casually, "Your cousin just bought an apartment." The cousin information was never relevant to anything. It was just there, in the note, quietly existing, like a small, polite knife inserted between the seaweed and the soy sauce. My younger sister Yuna texted me once, "Bro, are you actually okay, or are you doing that thing where you say you're okay, but clearly aren't?" I replied, "I'm clearly not okay, but in a way I've decided is worth it." She sent a single thumbs up and never mentioned it again. That is why Yuna was my favorite person. My friends from college, the ones who'd gone into finance and tech, had stopped asking about the studio after year 1. Not meanly, just the way you stop asking about something when the answer is always the same. They'd say, "How's the anime thing going?" And I'd say, "Really good, actually." And they'd nod and change the subject. The gap between my life and theirs was quietly getting wider every single month. I knew it. I just decided, every day, that what I was doing was worth the gap. Some days I was more sure about that than others, but I kept deciding it. Here's what people who haven't done creative work don't understand. The bad version and the good version of a scene can sound almost identical to a normal person. To someone who knows what they're listening for, they are completely different universes. I could spend 6 hours on 40 seconds of dialogue, not because I was slow, because I could hear the difference between technically correct and actually alive. And technically correct was never going to be enough for me. It never was. My main voice actor was a guy named Ryu. He had the range of someone 3 times his experience level and the punctuality of a cat left to its own schedule. He once told me at 11 p.m. in the soundproofed closet during our 8th hour of a session, "Kai, you're going to make something incredible or have a complete breakdown." Honestly, he said, eating a convenience store sandwich while he said it, "it could go either way on any given Tuesday." I said, "Ryu, I think both things are going to happen at the same time." He nodded. "Yeah, that tracks." We went back to work. The studio, we called it Blue Reel, which I thought sounded professional, and everyone else thought sounded like a fishing company, ran for 4 years before things started to shift. Not in a dramatic way. In the slow grinding way that financial reality moves when it has decided it is coming for you specifically. The streaming platform that was our main client renegotiated their rates, which is a polite way of saying they cut our pay by 30% and called it a partnership opportunity. We could accept the new terms, or they would find a studio that would. There are always studios that will. I accepted and spent 2 days not sleeping doing the math. We could survive, barely, if nothing else changed and everything went right and the universe chose to be cooperative for approximately 18 consecutive months. The universe was not in a cooperative mood. 3 months after the rate cut, our second biggest client dissolved. Not went under, dissolved. 2 founders had a disagreement over one weekend that by Monday had consumed the entire company. I found out via an email that began with "due to unforeseen circumstances" and ended with "we wish Blue Reel all the best." Sent at 6:43 a.m. on a Monday, the time you send news you don't want to discuss. I sat with that email for a while, made coffee, did the math again, made more coffee. The math did not improve with additional coffee. It had gotten substantially worse. Here is the thing about running a small creative studio. You are never doing one job. You are the creative director, the project manager, the accountant, and the equipment maintenance person simultaneously. You are also the one who stays after everyone else leaves to go over the files one more time, because you cannot send something into the world that isn't as good as you can make it. All of those things, all of the time, for 4 years, for money that would have made my college friends genuinely concerned for my welfare, and I still walked in every morning like it was exactly where I was supposed to be, because it was. For 4 years, it actually was. Then came the call. It was a Thursday evening. I remember because Thursdays were session days and Ryu and I had been in the booth since 2 p.m. We were on an action sequence with 17 lines of overlapping dialogue, and the timing was a complete disaster. I was manually reconstructing one layer at a time. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answer maybe 30% of unknown numbers. The other 70 I let go to voicemail and then listen with the energy of someone diffusing something. I answered this one. I don't know why. Some instinct I couldn't name told me to pick up. I picked up. Is this Kai? The voice on the other end was smooth, controlled, the kind of voice used to being listened to by people who have no choice but to listen. Depends who's asking. A pause, then almost amused. My name is Marcus Vane. I represent a private investment group. We've been watching your work for some time. I looked at Ryu through the glass. He raised an eyebrow. I held up one finger and walked to the corner of the booth. Which work specifically? I said. Blue Reel's catalog, specifically your directorial choices on the Hollow Arc series from last spring. The emotional calibration was unusual. We thought it was accidental at first. He paused. Then we went through your earlier projects and realized it wasn't. I sat down on the floor of the booth. My legs had decided this was a sitting down kind of conversation and made the decision without consulting me. Okay, I said. What does a private investment group want with emotional calibration in anime dubbing? Mr. Kai, what I'm about to tell you will sound unusual. I would ask you to hear it completely before responding. I said nothing. He apparently took that as agreement. We have been looking for a specific kind of person for a specific kind of role. Not a financial person, not a media executive, someone who understands how narrative shapes perception. How sound shapes emotion, he continued. How the story people tell themselves about a situation determines every decision they make within it. We believe you are that person. I looked at Ryu through the glass. He was eating another convenience store sandwich. He pointed at it questioningly. I shook my head. What kind of offer? I said. The kind that requires a meeting. In person. Tomorrow, if possible. I said I had sessions. I know, he said. They can wait. Something about the certainty of that. Not arrogant, just the certainty of someone who already knows how a conversation ends before it has finished happening. He gave me an address in a part of the city I'd never had a reason to visit. Then, come alone. Don't mention this call to anyone until after we've met. The call ended. I sat on the floor of the recording booth for 3 minutes doing nothing at all. Then Ryu's voice came through the monitor. Hey, you good? Yeah, I think something weird just happened. Weird good or weird bad? I thought about it. Don't know yet. He nodded through the glass. Cool. Can we get back to line 12? The timing's still off. We got back to line 12, but for the first time in 4 years, my mind was somewhere other than the booth, and it stayed there for the rest of the night. The building had no signage. That was the first thing I noticed. Not just no company name, literally nothing. No street number, no brand, nothing that told you this was a place you were supposed to be able to find. I checked the address 3 times standing on the sidewalk before the glass doors opened on their own. Nobody touched them. They just opened, like they knew I was there. The lobby had one desk, one person behind it who looked at me the way security staff look at people they've been expecting for a while, but are too professional to admit it. No sign-in sheet, no visitor badge, just, "Mr. Kai, 22nd floor, he's ready." The elevator moved without a sound. I pressed 22 and the doors closed, and I stood there in the silence thinking about the fact that I had told nobody where I was going. Marcus Vane was standing at the window when I walked in. The room had one long table, 2 chairs, and a view of the city that made everything below look like a diagram someone was studying. He was taller than his voice suggested, late 40s, dark suit, no tie. He turned when I entered and extended a hand. "Thank you for coming." "You were pretty sure I would." "I was reasonably confident," he said. "Sit, please." I sat. He stayed at the window a moment longer, looking down at the city like he was checking something. "We are constructing something," he said. "Not a company in the traditional sense, something that functions more like a system, a financial architecture with a narrative layer. The story that the world tells itself about who has power and why," he said. "We are building that story from the ground up, and we need someone who understands story the way you do." I said, "I make anime sound good. I don't know what that has to do with financial architecture." He turned from the window. "You spent 6 hours last March on 40 seconds of a scene where a character makes a decision. Not an action scene, a quiet scene. A character sitting alone deciding what kind of person they're going to be. You got 23 takes. Take 22 was technically perfect. You chose take 19. Why?" I stared at him for a moment. Then I said, "Take 19 had a breath in it, before the line. Half a second. The character hesitates. Take 22 was cleaner, but the hesitation wasn't there, and the hesitation was the whole scene. Without it, the character has already decided. With it, you see them in the moment of deciding." I paused. "That's the only moment that's actually true." Marcus Vane looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "That is exactly why you are here." He placed a folder on the table between us. He didn't open it. "What I'm about to propose will require you to walk away from Blue Reel. It requires discretion. And it requires you to trust that what you're walking into is worth walking into before you fully understand what it is." He opened the folder, turned it to face me. I looked at the number on the page. I looked at it for a long time. "That's not a salary," I said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." "What exactly am I supposed to do for that number?" Marcus Vane leaned back, and for the first time since I walked in, something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but the outer edge of something that might eventually become respect. "You're going to help us build the most important story anyone has ever told," he said. "The same way you fixed that scene in March, by finding the moment that's actually true." I looked back at the folder. The number was still there. I thought about Ryu eating sandwiches at midnight, my mother's care packages, my father and Uncle Deho's logistics position every Sunday at 7 p.m. for 4 years. I thought about the feeling when a scene locks in, about take 19, about the hesitation before the line. The moment of deciding. "When do I start?" I said. Marcus Vane almost smiled. "You already have," he said. I found out 3 days later what I had actually agreed to, and I want to be honest. If I had known in that room what I found out 3 days later, I genuinely don't know if I would have said yes. But I also don't know that I would have said no, and that uncertainty is its own kind of answer if you think about it long enough. What I found out started with a name, not Marcus Vane's name, another one that his assistant, a woman named Sio, who knew everything and said almost nothing, dropped on my second day in the building. The name was Elian Voss. I was given a desk on the 19th floor, windows everywhere, which after 4 years in a soundproofed apartment felt almost aggressive, a laptop, an access card, a stack of files SEO set on the corner of my desk without explanation and left without waiting for questions. I opened the first file. It took 40 minutes to understand what I was reading, another 20 to understand why it had been given to me specifically. Elian Voss had built something over 15 years that the files described as a narrative financial architecture, which sounds like nonsense until you read the details. The details were extraordinary. Here is what Voss had actually done. He had figured out that markets don't run on numbers. Everyone thinks markets run on numbers. Markets run on stories. The story of a company's future. The story of a currency's meaning. Numbers are just the language the story gets written in. Change the story, the real story, the one people feel before they think, and the numbers follow. Voss had spent 15 years building a system that could identify the exact moment a narrative was vulnerable to being rewritten, and then rewrite it, quietly, precisely. The way you fix a scene not by recording it again, but by finding the one thing that isn't working and correcting only that. Take 19, not 22. The hesitation, not the clean version. I sat with that for a long time. Then I found the second file, the one with my name on it, not my name in the sense of Kai, voice director, my name in the sense of a full dossier, photographs, session recordings from Blue Reel. Someone had been accessing our files. Notes about specific creative decisions I'd made across 4 years. 12 annotated examples. All of them analyzed with the same precision the first file had applied to market narratives. Someone had been studying me for a very long time before Marcus Vane called. I went and found CO. She was typing something with the calm of a person who is never surprised by anything. "How long?" I said. She looked up. "Mr. Voss began taking an interest in your work approximately 2 years ago. The formal assessment began 14 months ago." "What made the timing correct?" I asked. She chose which part of the truth to hand over with the care of someone handling something breakable. "Blue Reel's financial situation," she said, "and your response to it. I thought about the 2 days I hadn't slept after the rate cut, the math I'd done and redone, the decisions I'd made quietly about what I was and wasn't willing to sacrifice to keep the studio alive. Someone had been watching me make those decisions. The decisions had apparently been the right answer to a test I hadn't known I was taking. "I want to meet Voss," I said. SEO returned to her typing. "Mr. Voss will meet with you when he determines the timing is correct. It's a pattern you'll come to recognize." I went back to my desk and opened the third file. The third file was about the Tren family. And that is when everything I thought I understood about why I was in this building turned completely inside out. The Tren family were either one of the 3 most powerful financial dynasties in the region, or a myth competitors had invented to explain losses they couldn't account for any other way. They controlled, formally on paper, a network of holding companies, insurance, real estate, 2 mid-sized banks, a logistics company, a media licensing firm. Separately, none of these things meant much. Together, structured the specific way the Tren family had structured them over 40 years, they formed something the file described with deliberate understatement as significant systemic leverage. In plain language, if the Tren family wanted something to stop working, they could make it stop working, quietly, structurally, the way a building develops a foundation problem that doesn't show from the outside until one day it does. The Tren family had, approximately 3 years ago, decided that Elian Voss needed to stop. Not Voss personally. His architecture. His system. They wanted it absorbed and dismantled from the inside, the way you don't demolish a building. You quietly acquire everything around it until the building has no reason to stand anymore. I read this file twice. Then I sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then I thought about something Voss had written in a private note included in the file, dated 8 months ago. The answer to a structural problem is never a structural solution. It's a narrative one. Find someone who understands that. I looked at the folder with my name on it. I looked at the note. I looked at the ceiling. "Okay," I said to nobody in the empty office. "So that's what this is." I had walked into a building with no name to become the narrative solution to a structural problem involving one of the most powerful families in the region. and I had agreed to this because a man asked me why I chose take 19 over take 22 on a 40-second scene that nobody except Ryu and I had ever watched more than once. My father called that Sunday at 7 p.m. Same time, same opening about Uncle Deho. I sat in my new office and said, "Dad, I think I found something." A pause. Unusual. He didn't usually pause. "What kind of something?" he said. I looked at the files, at the number in the folder, at 14 months of someone watching my decisions from a distance and apparently finding exactly what they were looking for. "The kind I don't fully understand yet," I said, "but I think it might be important." Another pause, then quieter than I had ever heard him. "Be careful, Kai." He had never said that before, not once in 4 years of Sunday calls. Fathers know things. They feel the shape of situations even without the details. "Yeah," I said, "I will." I didn't know, sitting there with the city visible through my new aggressive windows, that being careful was the one thing this situation was not going to allow me to be. The Tren family had already made their first move. It had been made 3 months before Marcus Vane ever picked up the phone to call me, drop a comment. When a stranger knows more about your life than your own family does, do you run, or do you stay to find out why? The Tren family's first move happened before I walked into that building, before the phone call, before anyone said my name in that context. I found out on day 4. SEO put a folder on my desk, center-placed, precise, and was gone before I could form a question. No explanation, just the folder. Inside, one document, 12 pages, a corporate restructuring filing from 11 months ago that looked, on its surface, like standard administrative housekeeping. Holding company merged with subsidiary, assets redistributed, new board appointed. The kind of thing that gets processed and forgotten by everyone except the lawyers billing $400 an hour for it, ARSA. Except one of the redistributed assets was a media licensing firm, and that firm held contracts with 17 streaming platforms across the region, and one of those platforms was the exact one that had cut Blue Reel's rates by 30% 8 months ago. I read that line 3 times. Then I sat completely still for a while. The kind of still that happens when something you thought was bad luck turns out to have a signature on it. I found CO at her desk. She was doing something I had not seen her do before. Nothing. Hands folded, waiting. Like she'd known I was coming and had cleared her schedule for it. The rate cut that almost finished Blue Reel. I put the folder down on her desk. That was them. Not a question by the time it came out. She knew that. The restructuring gave the Tren family indirect operational influence over 4 streaming platforms in this region. Rate adjustments were implemented across 14 studios over 6 months. Why Blue Reel specifically? Because Mr. Voss had flagged your work. They were watching the same things we were watching. They wanted to see how you responded to pressure. I sat down in the chair across from her without being invited. She did not object. I appreciated that about Seal. She had a very rational relationship with formality. So the rate cut was a test, run by the people trying to destroy Voss, on a person Voss was also assessing at the same time. A preliminary assessment, yes. And I passed. You didn't close the studio. Most do at that margin reduction. You restructured your workflow, renegotiated with your voice cast, absorbed the loss personally for 2 months without telling anyone. How do you know I absorbed it personally? The pause she gave me was the closest thing to an expression I had seen on Seo's face in 4 days. Mr. Kai, we know quite a lot. Right. Of course they did, because 14 months of watching someone tends to generate data. Noted. I went back to my desk and looked at the window for a while without seeing it. I'd spent 4 years thinking I was just running a studio, making creative decisions, following a feeling when a scene locked in. It turned out I had also been, the entire time, a variable in someone else's equation, possibly 2 someone else's, running parallel assessments on the same person from opposite sides of a conflict I had not known existed. Here is the thing about finding that out. The feeling is not what you expect. You expect anger, the sensation of having been watched without consent, something hot and immediate. What I actually felt was recognition, like information arriving that explained things I hadn't known needed explaining. The rate cut, the dissolved client, the specific sequence of Blue Reel's financial deterioration over 8 months. I had always felt that sequence was deliberate. I had dismissed the feeling because the alternative, that someone was engineering pressure on a studio as obscure as mine, seemed too paranoid. Turns out paranoid and accurate are not mutually exclusive, filing that one away for future reference. On day 6, I went looking for Elian Voss, not because he had decided the timing was correct, because I was done waiting for him to decide. I found Seal. "Where is he?" She looked at me for a moment, then she wrote a floor number on a piece of paper and handed it to me. Not the floor I'd been working on, higher, above what my access card was programmed for. "Your card will work today," she said. "It may not work again." I took the stairs. The elevator felt like too much trust at that particular moment. The floor was different from the others. No overhead lighting, just windows on 3 sides, natural light cutting the space into sections. And at the far end, in a chair facing the city, a man who did not turn around when I came in. "You took the stairs." His voice was different from Vane's, quieter, the kind of quiet that isn't soft, it's precisely controlled. The elevator felt like too much trust. A pause, then, "Sit down, Kai." One chair across from his. I sat. Neither of us said anything for a moment. He was still looking at the city, which, at this height, looked even more like a diagram someone was running calculations on. "You read the restructuring filing. The rate cut was engineered. The Tren family ran an assessment on me while you were running one. Both of you started at the same time. Neither of you told me." "Yes. You let it happen. I didn't accelerate it. I didn't manufacture it. I observed what they had set in motion and observed your response. There is a distinction. For him, maybe. For Blue Reel's bank account, significantly less so. But I didn't say that out loud because I was trying to stay calibrated and not just reactively annoyed, which was genuinely taking effort. He turned, for the first time, and I looked at the face of Elian Voss, older than I'd built from the files. Not in an age way, in a weight way. The kind of face that has been carrying too many calculations for too long. The stillness around his eyes was the kind you develop when you've had to hold a position under pressure so many times that holding becomes the default. "You're angry," he said. "I'm calibrating. There's a difference." Something moved in his expression, very small, like a number updating somewhere behind his eyes. "The Tren family has been working to dismantle what I built for 3 years. They are patient, structural. They don't attack directly. They rearrange the environment until the thing they want gone has nowhere left to stand. Like acquiring influence over streaming platforms and using it to pressure studios you've flagged as interesting." That was relatively subtle for them. Their earlier moves were more direct. 3 of my senior analysts left the organization within 4 months of each other. Different reasons, different circumstances, all legitimate on the surface. But not actually. One had a tax irregularity surface that shouldn't have been findable. One had a personal situation become complicated in ways requiring relocation. One simply changed his mind about the work, which is his right. But the timing was precise. I turned that over. "They cleared your bench, removed everyone who understood the architecture well enough to defend it. What remains is a framework that functions but cannot be developed or defended by anyone currently in the organization, except me. And now, potentially, me." He looked at me. "That is what I'm trying to determine." I looked at the city through 3 walls of window. Tiny pieces moving through a diagram. Each one a decision being made by someone who thinks they're making it freely. "The Hollow Arc scene. Episode 7. He knew which one. You watched it yourself. Not just notes from whoever was assessing me. You watched the actual footage." "Yes." "What did you see?" Voss was quiet for a moment. Not performing the quiet, actually sitting with it. Someone who understood that the most important moment in any communication is not the thing being said. It's the space before it, the weight of what exists just before the words arrive. He paused. "I've spent 15 years trying to explain that to people with financial backgrounds. They understand it intellectually, they don't feel it. You think I feel it. I think you built a professional practice around it without knowing that's what you were doing. which is more useful than someone who learned it from a theory. Right, so I had spent 4 years accidentally developing the exact skill set that a man with a 15-year financial architecture needed to defend against an incoming narrative attack. Useful to know. Would have been nice to know earlier, but useful. What do you actually need me to do? He stood, moved to the window. When he spoke again, the same controlled quiet was there, but with something underneath it. Not urgency exactly, more like the awareness of a clock that has been running longer than is comfortable. The Tren family's next move will not be structural. They will attempt to change the story the market tells itself about this organization and about me personally. What kind of story? The kind that doesn't need to be true to be effective. Real facts, arranged in a sequence that implies something that didn't happen, spread through professional networks before anyone thinks to question the framing. Defamation with plausible deniability. Nothing provably false, just arranged wrong. I knew exactly what that looked like. I'd spent 4 years listening to audio where the story was technically in the words but actually in the order and the breath between them. You need someone who can identify the narrative before it fully forms, read the hesitation before the line lands. The thing from 14 months ago had a name. I found it on day 7 at 6 a.m. after pulling an all-nighter that I would not recommend to anyone who enjoys functioning like a human being. The name was Jin Rao. Not someone I'd heard of before, but the files were about to change what I thought I understood about everything. Jin Rao had been Voss's head of research for 9 years, the first analyst to leave 11 months before I arrived. Tax irregularity, the kind that surfaces quietly and then suddenly isn't quiet anymore. I had seen his name in the files before, flagged it, moved on, but now I was looking at the timeline differently. Jin Rao left 4 weeks after the Tren family sent that lunch confirmation to the media organization. 4 weeks after both sides started moving simultaneously. That was not a coincidence, that was a sequence. I built a timeline on paper because screens felt wrong for this kind of thinking. Analog. Laid it out across the entire desk. The date the Tren family lunch was confirmed. 4 weeks later, Jin Rao's tax situation surfaces. 3 weeks after that, Voss begins my formal assessment. 2 months after that, Blue Reel's rate cut lands. Everything downstream of one original moment. One trigger that started both clocks running at the same time. Jin Rao was the trigger. Not because he left. Everyone leaves eventually. Because of why he left. More specifically, because of what he knew before he walked out the door. I went back through 9 years of his work in the archive. Research notes, analysis frameworks, internal communications. Jin Rao was not just good at what he did. He was the person who had built the methodology that made Voss's system actually work at scale. The language shift detection engine, the sector vocabulary mapping, the early warning indicators that had called the Tren family's sectors 8 months before the market agreed. Jin Rao had built that. Voss had conceived the idea, but Jin Rao had made it real, functional, deployable at scale. And then Jin Rao had left, with a tax irregularity that had been, according to a legal memo in the archive, investigated, resolved, and closed within 6 weeks. Fast for that kind of thing. Very fast. Too fast, actually, if you were being honest about how these processes normally moved. I wrote that down, put a circle around it, drew 3 lines out from it. Then I went to find Seo. It was 6:30 a.m. and she was already at her desk, which told me either she arrived very early or she had never left, and neither option surprised me. I found Seo and put the timeline on her desk. Jin Rao, the tax irregularity, it was resolved in 6 weeks. That is very fast for that kind of process. She looked at the timeline, then at me. The pause she gave me had a different texture from her usual ones, more careful. The resolution was negotiated, she said. Mr. Rao provided certain information in exchange for an expedited outcome. What information? Another pause. Mr. Kai, there are aspects of the organizational history that Mr. Voss may prefer to share personally. SEO, what information? She looked at the timeline one more time. Something moved behind her eyes. Not discomfort exactly, more like the expression of a person deciding that a particular truth has now become more useful than the alternative. Jin Rao provided detailed documentation of the system's methodology. the language shift detection engine, the sector mapping protocols, the complete analytical framework. She paused. He provided it to the Tren family's legal representatives. Everything, in exchange for resolution of the tax matter and nothing else. I sat down on the edge of her desk without being invited, which I was pretty sure had never been done before in the history of whatever this organization was. She did not move her things. The Tren family has the full methodology. They've had it for 14 months, and nobody told me until right now. I sat with that for a while. Which is to say, I sat there feeling the specific sensation of a picture you thought you understood rearranging itself into something completely different while you watch. The Tren family was not trying to destroy Voss's system at all. They were trying to build their own version of it using his exact methodology as the foundation, and they needed the original to stop operating while they got theirs working, because two competing systems reading the same market created problems for the version that came second. They had the methodology. They were building the alternative, and the 6 to 8 week timeline Voss had given me wasn't for a defamation campaign. It was for a launch. They're going to market, I said. SEO did not confirm it or deny it, which was, from CO, confirmation. They're launching a competing system using Jin Rao's framework, and the narrative attack on Voss is the launch strategy. Destroy the credibility of the original before the copy goes public. Make the market doubt everything the original ever called correctly. Position the new version as the corrected, improved, trustworthy alternative, the one the market should have trusted all along. By the time anyone looked closely at the methodology, both versions would appear to be independent parallel developments and not what they actually were, which was theft, dressed up in a corporate restructuring filing and a tax irregularity and a lunch confirmation and 14 months of careful preparation. I went upstairs without taking the stairs this time. The elevator felt fine now. The uncertainty about whether to trust it had been replaced by a different kind of uncertainty, which was at least more interesting. Voss was at his window. He turned when I walked in, which was different from the last time. He was expecting me. "You found it," he said. "Jin Rao gave them the methodology. They're launching a competing system. The narrative campaign against you is the marketing strategy for the launch." He looked at me for a moment, then he turned back to the window. "I have known about Jin Rao for 11 months, he said. "I discovered it 3 weeks after he left." I processed that. "You knew for 11 months that they had the full methodology?" "Yes." "And you spent that time doing what exactly?" "Preparing." "Preparing what?" He turned back to me, and the look on his face was the one I had been trying to read since the first time I walked into this room. I understood it now. It was the look of someone who had been holding a position for a very long time and was now, finally, close enough to the end of the wait to let something show. "The methodology Jin Rao gave them is not the current methodology," he said. I went very still. When I discovered what Jin Rao had done, I rebuilt the system from the underlying logic outward. What Jin Rao provided was accurate. It was a complete and accurate representation of how the system worked 11 months ago. It will produce results. It will appear to function. He paused. It will also be approximately 8 months behind the current version in its predictive accuracy. Enough to be plausible, not enough to be right, consistently, over time. I thought about this very carefully before I said it. "You knew. You let them take the methodology. You let Jin Rao give it to them. And then you spent 11 months building a version they don't have, while they built a version using what they thought was your complete system. Jin Rao did not know the system had been updated. The update was quiet, internal, documented only in files he no longer had access to. So they're going to launch a system that works," I said, "just not as well as they think it does, and not as well as yours. Correctly. And when the market tests both versions over time, the one built on the current methodology will be consistently more accurate, not dramatically, enough. Enough. That word doing an enormous amount of work again. Enough to be right when the other version is wrong, consistently, in the ways that matter. Enough to rebuild a reputation while the copy slowly reveals the gap between what it promised and what it delivers." I looked at the city through the windows. The diagram of it. tiny pieces moving, each one a decision. You need the narrative to hold for long enough that the system can demonstrate the gap, I said. 6 to 8 weeks of incoming attack, during which the market needs to remain uncertain rather than convinced. If they land the campaign before your counter-narrative is in place, the doubt sticks. And doubt is sticky enough that even when the numbers prove you right later, the frame has already been set. Yes. So the counter-narrative isn't just protection. It's the gap between launch and proof. You need to buy enough time for the market to see both systems operating simultaneously and draw its own conclusions. He looked at me with the expression that had moved through his face the first time I said the thing he had been trying to get someone to say. Yes, he said, exactly that. I went back to my desk, started building. Not the counter-narrative itself, the map underneath it. The story that was actually true, laid out in the sequence that made it feel true before any argument could land. Because here is the thing I knew from 4 years in a recording booth. You cannot argue someone into an emotional response. You can only create the conditions in which the right emotion becomes inevitable. Then the logic follows naturally, because people build arguments to explain what they already feel. The Tren family was going to build an argument, a careful one, using real facts arranged wrong. They were going to tell the market a story about a man whose system was unreliable, whose methodology was flawed, whose track record had a hidden problem that undermined everything. I needed the market to already know Voss before that story arrived, not know him as a defense against the attack. That would look like exactly what it was. Know him the way you know something you felt first. So I started with the sectors. Voss's system had called 18 significant market movements correctly over 15 years. The files documented all of them, the language shifts, the timing, the calls, the outcomes. I read all 18 in sequence, and then I did something Voss's team had apparently never done. I told them as a story, not a track record, not a data presentation, a story about how language changes before reality does, and what that sounds like if you know how to listen. About the specific moments in each sector where the vocabulary shifted before the numbers, and what that shift sounded like if you were listening for it. I told it the way I would have directed a scene, finding the moment that was actually true in each one. The hesitation before the number moved, the breath before the line. By day 9, I had a draft. Not finished, a draft. Something that could be placed when the time was right, in the kind of professional conversation that shapes opinion without appearing to. Voss read it that evening. He sat with it for a long time. "This is not what I expected," he said, which from Voss was the equivalent of someone else saying they needed a moment to sit down. "What did you expect?" "A rebuttal framework, counterpoints to anticipated claims, a defensive structure." "Rebuttals confirm the frame," I said, which was what he had told me, and which he recognized, and which produced the smallest version of what I was starting to recognize as his version of a smile, a very slight adjustment in the stillness around his eyes. "Where do you place it?" he said. "Not where they expect. They expect professional media, analyst publications, market commentary. They'll be watching those channels for defensive moves and prepared to respond." I had thought about this for 2 days. The first placement goes somewhere they're not watching. Somewhere the audience overlaps, but the approach is different enough that they don't see it coming until it's landed. "Where?" I told him. He went still in the specific way that meant he was running calculations. "That's not a financial audience," he said. "No, it's an audience that talks to the financial audience, the people who shape the conversation before it becomes a formal conversation, the ones who decide what the frame is before the argument starts." He thought about this for a long time. "Yes," he said. "Yes, that's right." "Good. Now, for the part I hadn't told him yet. I also need to talk to Jin Rao." The stillness that moved through Voss when I said that was different from his usual kind, more charged, the kind that's holding something back. Jin Rao is no longer affiliated with this organization. The way Voss said that made it sound final, closed, not up for discussion. "I know. That's why I need to talk to him, not as part of this organization, as someone who built the original methodology and knows exactly what the Tren version is missing." Jin Rao made a choice that... Jin Rao got his tax problem resolved in 6 weeks by a family that had the resources to make it disappear overnight and chose to draw it out over 6 weeks specifically to make sure he had enough time to feel how bad it could get if they decided to stop helping. I let that sit for a moment. I've read the timeline. I know how that process moved. That wasn't someone making a free choice. That was someone being very carefully squeezed until they gave what was asked for. A long pause, the kind that confirms a thing without saying it. Then, "You don't know that?" Voss again, quieter this time. "No, but I know what Take 19 sounds like, and the Jin Rao I read in 9 years of research notes is not the person who handed over a methodology he spent a decade building because he wanted to." The silence that followed was the longest I had experienced in this building, longer than the one in Voss's office the first time, longer than Seo's most loaded pause. Then Voss said, "His number is in the personnel files." No other commentary. I went back to my desk, found the number, and called it immediately. Jin Rao picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting a call from this number eventually, and had decided to answer it rather than let it go to voicemail. That told me something. "I know who you are," he said. His voice was tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that tired has become the baseline. "Then you know why I'm calling." "They're launching in 6 weeks." "Yes." I told him, Voss. I sent him everything I could document about what they took and how, 8 months ago. He didn't respond. I filed that away. He responded, just not in the direction you expected. A pause. "What do you need from me?" "The gaps. What the version they have is missing, not the technical details. I don't need the code. I need to understand what it gets wrong and when. What calls it will make that the current system wouldn't make. Where the divergence shows up first." A longer pause, the kind that's doing real work. The language detection in the current version has a recalibration mechanism built in. The original version I gave them didn't have it. The original version drifts over time. The vocabulary mapping starts to lag the market by about 2 quarters after initial deployment. The new version corrects for that automatically. So the version the Trend family is launching, it will look accurate for the first several months. Then it will start to lag behind the market. Yes, not obviously, subtly. The kind of gap that shows up in the calls that almost worked but didn't, the near misses. If you know what to look for, you can see it in the output. If you don't know what you're looking for, it looks like normal variance. And the market won't know what to look for. Not unless someone tells them specifically what the recalibration mechanism does, why it matters, and what to look for in the output over time. I wrote this down. One more thing. The original call that started all of this. The Trend family sectors. The one that cost them the significant loss. Was there a specific moment in the language data where the shift was clearest? A single indicator that would have been obvious in retrospect to anyone reading it? Jin Rao was quiet for a moment. There was a change in the vocabulary used by mid-level executives in one of the Trend sectors in their internal communications. We had access to public-facing versions, earnings calls, investor letters. The language in those shifted 6 weeks before the market moved, not dramatically, but the words they stopped using were just as telling as the new ones. I wrote down the next question before I finished thinking it. "Which words exactly?" He told me. I wrote them down, read them back to make sure I had them right. That's what the story sounds like when a company knows something is coming but isn't saying it yet, I said. "Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like." I sat with that for a moment. Then, "Jin Rao, the tax thing. How long did they actually have the documentation before they surfaced it?" The pause on his end was the kind that confirmed a thing without saying it. 14 months before they used it, he said. They had it the whole time. They waited until the moment was useful. Right. So the Trend family had held that leverage for over a year before they chose to apply it. Patient, structural, exactly the way Voss had described them. They hadn't forced Jin Rao because they needed the methodology immediately. They had forced him because the timing had become correct. "Thank you," I said. "Does it help?" he said, not defensively, just asking. "It helps a lot." A pause, then quieter. "Tell him I'm sorry. Not because it changes anything, just because it's true. I said I would, and I meant it, and I did that evening when I went back to Voss's floor and told him what Jin Rao had said and watched something shift in the stillness around his eyes that I chose not to name because it was private. By day 12, I had the full map. The original story, complete. The Tren version, complete. The gaps between them, documented precisely in the language of someone who understood that the gap was the story. The counter-narrative was not going to be a defense, it was going to be a revelation, the kind that doesn't argue, it just arrives and sits there being true. The kind that arrives quietly, through the right channels, at the right moment, and lands the way Take 19 lands, not because it argues, but because it feels unmistakably true. I spent 3 days writing it. Not in one sitting. The same way I always worked, an hour on, an hour thinking, back to the draft. In the same way I'd always worked, an hour on, an hour thinking, back to the draft, listening for the moment when something shifted from technically correct to actually alive. On day 15, I had something I would have sent out into the world from a studio in a converted apartment that smelled like old carpet, which was the bar I had always used. Not good enough for the client. Not good enough for a client I was trying to impress. Good enough that I would have put my name on it without hesitation. So I sent it to Voss. He read it for a long time. Then he came downstairs, which, I had come to understand, was the equivalent of anyone else standing up and crossing a room, given how rarely he left his floor. He put the printed draft on my desk. On top of it, he put a single piece of paper with a handwritten note. The note said, "This is the one." 4 words. From Elian Voss, who used language the way a precision instrument uses a scale, nothing more than exactly what was needed. I looked at those 4 words for a while. Then I looked at the draft. At 23 pages that told a story the market did not know yet, but was about to. A story that arrived before the Tren family's version. That made their version, when it came, land slightly wrong, like a voice actor hitting a technically correct note a half second before the animation, and the whole moment becoming uncanny instead of real. Take 19, not 22. 4 weeks left, possibly 5. The Tren family was moving, but they were moving with the confidence of people who did not know yet that the audience had already been prepared. That confidence they had, the kind built on 3 years of preparation and what they believed was a complete picture. That was about to change, and the thing I had not told Voss yet, the part of the counter-narrative I had kept back, the piece that wasn't in the draft, was the piece that would make the whole thing irreversible once it landed. The specific words the Tren family executives had stopped using in their communications 6 weeks before the market moved. The ones Jin Rao had told me, those words were going to appear in the story. Not as an accusation, not as a revelation, just present, embedded in the narrative, visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. And the Tren family, the moment they read it, would know exactly what they were looking at and what it meant that it existed. They would know that someone had talked to Jin Rao. They would know that someone understood the specific mechanism of what they had done and how. They would know that the story arriving in the market was not a defense. It was a demonstration, and they would know it before they launched, which meant they would be making a choice about whether to proceed anyway, knowing that the gap between their version and Voss's would be visible to anyone reading carefully from the start. I was not trying to stop the launch. I did not have the resources or the timeline to stop the launch. I was making the launch into a different story than they had planned for it to be. That is the thing about narrative. You cannot always stop the other person from speaking, but you can change what their words mean by the time they arrive. Voss called it constructing a counter-narrative. I thought of it differently, the way I had always thought about every scene that needed fixing. I thought of it the way I had thought about every scene that needed fixing in 4 years of working in a studio that paid us just enough to keep the lights on. Find the hesitation, the breath before the line, the moment of deciding, and make sure the audience has already felt the true version of it before the arranged version lands. Then step back and let the difference do the work on its own. That's always been the move. Take 19, never 22. 4 weeks out from the Tren family's launch, I did something nobody in that building expected. Something Voss hadn't asked for and SEO hadn't anticipated, and that changed everything. I asked Voss for a list of every person who had left the organization in the past 3 years. Not just the 3 senior analysts he had told me about. Everyone. Support staff, junior researchers, people who had stayed 6 months and moved on. The full list. He gave it to me without asking why, which told me he had been waiting for someone to ask. There were 23 names. I read through all of them over the course of one evening, building the same kind of map I had built for the sectors and for Jin Rao, looking for the pattern underneath the surface pattern. 23 people. 22 of them added nothing new. And then I found it. Name 17. A junior researcher named Lena Park, left 14 months ago. The same window as everything else. Reason listed in the HR file. Personal relocation. New city, new opportunity. Fresh start. The kind of listed reason that closes an HR file permanently without opening any questions about what actually happened. Except that Lena Park had not relocated. I found her professional profile on a public industry database still listed at her previous address in the same city, currently listed as a freelance consultant. Freelance, after leaving a full-time research position with Voss's organization at exactly the moment the Tren family started moving. I sat with that for about 30 seconds. Then I called Jin Rao back. "Lena Park," I said. "She left the same window you did. What do you know about her?" A pause on his end, longer than the ones he had given me before, the kind of pause that exists because the answer is complicated and the person is deciding how much of that to show. "Lena was the one who built the data pipeline," he said, "the system that feeds the language detection engine. She didn't build the methodology. I built that. But without her pipeline, the methodology has no inputs. It's a brain with no sensory system. And the Tren version needs a pipeline. Every version needs a pipeline. It's the hardest part to build from scratch. The methodology I gave them tells them how to analyze the language. It doesn't tell them how to collect it at scale without the collection being visible. I thought about this. Visible to who? To the markets themselves, to the companies being monitored. If the data collection is detectable, the companies start managing the language rather than using it naturally. The signal disappears. The whole system stops working. So Lena Park built the invisible pipeline, and she left 14 months ago, and she's listed as a freelance consultant doing unspecified work. Yes, and the Tren family has her too. Not a question. The pause confirmed it. "I didn't know for certain," Jin Rao said. "I suspected. I didn't have anything I could document." I thanked him and hung up and sat in the dark of my office for a while, because it was past 11 p.m. and I had stopped bothering with the overhead light sometime around day 8. The Tren family did not have a copy of Voss's system. They had something potentially more dangerous. They had the 2 people who had built the original from the ground up, working for them directly, which meant the version they were launching in 4 weeks was not a copy of the old methodology running on a reconstructed pipeline. It was a new build. Jin Rao's methodology, Lena Park's pipeline architecture, rebuilt from first principles by the people who had invented those principles. And the gap I had been counting on, the recalibration mechanism that Jin Rao had told me the Tren version was missing, might not exist anymore. Because Lena Park would know exactly what a recalibration mechanism required at the pipeline level, even if Jin Rao had never specifically told her about it. Good builders understand what a system needs before anyone tells them what's missing. That's what separates them from everyone else. Lena Park was a good builder. I went back to the draft. 23 pages. "This is the one," Voss had written. He'd been right when he wrote it. He might still be right. But I needed to know something before I placed it. I went upstairs the next morning without taking the stairs, without second-guessing the elevator, without any of the hesitations I'd had on the first visit. Voss was at his window. He was always at his window when I arrived, which I had started to think was less about the view and more about having a direction to look that wasn't directly at whoever was coming in. "Lena Park," I said. He turned around. The stillness in his face did something I had not seen it do before. Not movement exactly, more like a shift in what was being held still. "Yes, he said. She built the pipeline. The Tren family has her, which means the gap in their system, the recalibration issue Jinrao described, may not actually be there. He was quiet for a moment, long enough to confirm it before he said it. I know about Lena. You knew and didn't tell me. Not a question. I told you what you needed to build the counter-narrative. You told me what you thought I needed. That's different. I sat down without being invited, which had stopped feeling unusual about a week ago. If their system doesn't have the recalibration gap, then the long gameplay dissolves completely and we're left with a counter-narrative that buys 6 weeks and then nothing. 6 to 8 weeks of holding damage and then nothing. Their system performs and the market decides we were wrong. We release the counter-narrative, it holds the damage for 6 to 8 weeks, and then their system performs accurately, and the market decides you were wrong about them. Yes. Then tell me about Lena. He said nothing for a moment. The city doing its diagram thing in the windows behind him, indifferent to all of it. Lena Park didn't leave because the Tren family pressured her, he said. She left because she disagreed with a decision I made about how the system should be used. I waited. There was a point, approximately 18 months ago, where I had the opportunity to use the system's predictive capability in a way that would have been financially very significant. Not illegal, not unethical in any technical sense, but using information about language shifts in a sector to position ahead of an event that would cause significant harm to people who were not aware of what was coming. You could see the crash before it happened, I said, and you could have profited from it. Yes. And you chose not to. I chose not to. Lena believed the choice should have been different, not because she wanted the profit, because she believed that if the system existed and could be used to protect people who were about to be harmed, choosing not to use it was itself a moral failure. I sat with that for a long moment. It was not a simple position. I was aware of exactly how not simple it was. She was wrong, I said, but she wasn't obviously wrong. No, she wasn't. He paused. She went to the Tren family because she believed they would use the system the way she thought it should be used, proactively, actively. And have they? A pause with a different texture. Their initial deployment has identified 3 significant market events in the past 8 months. In 2 of those cases, they positioned for profit. In the 3rd case, and I only know this because Jinrao told me, they used the information to warn a connected institutional client whose pension holdings were at risk. 1 out of 3 times, they had used what they knew to protect someone who didn't know they were in danger. That was not nothing. It was also not a pattern I was prepared to call good. So the gap, I said, the recalibration mechanism, is it there or not? Voss looked at me. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. Lena is exceptional. If she recognized the drift issue from the pipeline side and built a compensation mechanism without being told to, the gap may not exist. And if it doesn't exist, then the long game play, as you've described it, has a different timeline. Their system will be competitive. Not identical to mine, the current methodology has developments that neither Jinrao nor Lena was aware of, but competitive enough that the market may not reach a clear conclusion on its own. I thought about this for a long time, not because the answer was complicated, because the answer was simple, and simple answers in complicated situations tend to be wrong. The city outside was doing what cities do on grey mornings, existing in a way that made individual decisions seem both very small and somehow very consequential at the same time. I need to talk to Lena Park, I said. She won't respond to contact from this organization. Not from this organization, from me. I paused. She left because of immoral disagreement. She's been with people who she believed would use the system correctly and found out 1 out of 3 times they actually did. That's not the ratio someone with a genuine moral framework accepts quietly. Voss looked at me for a long moment. The kind of look that's doing calculation rather than communication. You don't know that's how she's experiencing it. No, but I know what Take 19 sounds like, and I know what it sounds like when the take someone chose turned out to be the wrong one. He said nothing. I stood up. Her number, I said. He wrote it down on a piece of paper and handed it to me. No comment, no instruction. just the number, in handwriting that was smaller and more careful than I had expected from a man with his degree of control over everything else. Lena Park picked up on the fourth ring. Not the second, like Jin Rao. The fourth. The difference between someone who had been expecting the call and someone who had been deciding whether to answer it. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was different from what I had built in my head. Steadier. The kind of steady that has been earned rather than natural. "Then you know why I'm calling. You're calling because the counter-narrative Voss built needs to account for the fact that I exist and that the system the Tren family is launching may not have the gaps you've been counting on. Straight to it. Good. I didn't have time for anything else anyway. Does it have the recalibration mechanism?" A pause. "Why would I tell you that?" "Because you left Voss over a decision about whether to use the system to protect people who didn't know they were at risk. And the Tren family has used it that way once in 8 months. Once, out of 3 opportunities." Silence on her end. Not uncomfortable silence, working silence, the kind that's actually processing rather than performing hesitation. "The pipeline has a drift compensation layer," she said. "It's not the same as the recalibration mechanism in Voss's current version. I didn't know what that looked like exactly, but it addresses the same problem from the collection side rather than the analysis side. Whether it fully closes the gap, I don't know. I haven't seen the current methodology specs. Would it close the gap in the first 12 months? That's the window that matters. That's when the market forms its opinion and the frame gets set." A longer pause. "Probably. Yes. The first 12 months, their output should be close enough to the current version that the market wouldn't see a meaningful difference." So the long game was gone. 12 months of near-equivalent performance was enough for the Tren family's launch narrative to stick. By the time any divergence appeared, the market frame would already be set. "Lena." I waited a beat. "The third event, the one where they warned the pension fund about the exposure. Walk me through how that decision got made." A silence on her end. Did they warn them because they had a policy of using the system that way? Or because someone in the Tren family had a personal connection to the fund? The pause she gave me was the longest one yet. Longer than Jin Rao's. Longer than Seo's. The length of a pause that has real weight in it. "Personal connection," she said, quietly. "I found out 6 weeks ago." There it was. Not 1 out of 3 times using the system to protect people. 0 out of 3. The one time that had looked like the right use of the system had been a favor to someone who mattered to the right person in the Tren family. Lena Park had left Voss over a moral disagreement, and the people she'd gone to had used her work as a favor mechanism, not a protection mechanism, and she had found out 6 weeks ago and had been sitting with it since. "How long have you been waiting for someone to call?" I said. A breath. Small. The kind you don't mean to let out. "Since I found out," she said. I looked at the number Voss had written on the piece of paper in his careful small handwriting. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight," I said. "Ask." "If the counter-narrative includes what I now know about the pipeline, about the drift compensation, about the 1 out of 3 and the personal connection, does it change what you're willing to say publicly about the Tren version's limitations?" Silence. Long and working. "If I'm a source," she said, "not named, not identified, but a source who can be confirmed by people in the right positions who will confirm without naming me." A pause. The long, working kind. Then, "Yes. If those are the terms, then yes. It changes what I'm willing to say publicly about the architecture and what it's missing." I sat back in my chair. The city outside had shifted from grey to the kind of pale afternoon light that makes everything look slightly more real than it actually is. Lena Park had just handed me the ending of the story, not the one I had been building, not the defensive counter-narrative that bought Voss 6 to 8 weeks. Something different, something that didn't defend Voss at all, that changed the entire frame of what the incoming narrative was attacking and why any of it mattered. I went back to the draft. 23 pages that Voss had called The One. I read the whole thing from the beginning. Then I deleted 11 pages of it and started writing the new version. This is what I had now, Voss's full 15-year track record, told as a story about how language changes before reality does. Jin Rao's account of the methodology, on the record, named his own words, his own framing of what happened to him and why. Lena Park's technical assessment of the Tren version's architecture, unattributed, confirmable by anyone willing to look at the ownership structures carefully enough, and the detail about the pension fund sourced in a way that would be verifiable by anyone who looked carefully at the ownership structures and the timing. The story I was telling was no longer, Voss is trustworthy, doubt the incoming attack. It was something harder to argue against than that. It was, here is what this system actually does. Here is who built it and what happened to them. And here is what the alternative actually is. Not what they say it is, what it actually is. Not a defense, a disclosure. The kind that doesn't need to argue, because the facts, arranged in the order they actually happened, tell their own story to anyone willing to read them. I worked for 18 hours straight without leaving the desk, which I mention only because 18 hours is long enough that you stop noticing you're tired and start noticing everything else instead. No noodles this time. SEO had apparently decided, sometime around day 10, that I was going to forget to eat unless someone put food near me, and had started leaving things on my desk at mealtimes without comment or expectation of acknowledgement. I ate whatever she left without looking at it. It was always good. SEO had opinions about food that she expressed entirely through selection. At 3 a.m. I had 41 pages, the longest thing I had written since a production thesis in college that I had spent 4 months on and which had been read by exactly 2 people and a committee. At 4 a.m. I cut it to 31 pages by doing what I always did with a draft, going through it the way I went through a session, finding the places where the voice was correct and the places where it was technically right but not actually alive, and cutting the technically right parts. At 5 a.m. I had 27 pages and it was the one. Not because Voss had said so, because I could feel when a thing locked in. 4 years in a soundproofed closet learning exactly what that felt like. When the voice and the timing and the breath all click into place and the key turns in the lock that was made exactly for it. 27 pages. One story, true from the first sentence to the last without hedging or arrangement. I sent it to Voss at 5:14 a.m. and then sat back and felt the specific quiet of having finished the thing. At 5:31 a.m. he replied, not with a note this time, not 4 words, just a time and an address that I had not seen in any of the files. I was there by 6:15 a.m. The address was a building I recognized, not from the files, from walking past it in a different part of the city for years without knowing what happened inside it. A financial media organization. The kind that does not write about markets. It writes about the people and systems and decisions that shape markets before they're visible to anyone writing about markets. The kind of organization that shapes the conversation before it becomes a formal conversation. Before the arguments start. Before the frame is set. The audience that talks to the financial audience. The place I had told Voss to place the story 4 weeks ago, when I had a different version of it. There was a woman waiting at the entrance. Late 50s. The kind of face that has been in rooms where important things were decided for long enough that it has stopped being impressed by importance but has not stopped paying attention to it. She looked at me the way CO had looked at me the first morning. Expected. "You're Kai," she said. "Yes. The story is longer than we usually run." "I know. Walk me through why it can't be shorter." I thought about Jin Rao on the phone at midnight with his tired voice. About Lena Park and the breath she hadn't meant to let out. About Voss at his window looking at a diagram of the city instead of the city itself because some part of him had stopped being able to afford the difference. Because the only part you can cut is the part that makes it feel true instead of just accurate, I said. And accurate without true doesn't hold. It just sits there looking like a document. Documents don't change anything. Stories do. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she stepped aside from the entrance. "We publish Thursday," she said. "The Tren family launches Friday." 1 day between the story and the launch. 24 hours for the market to read what was true before it heard what was arranged. 1 day between the story the market needed and the story they were about to be sold. Not a lot of time. Enough. It was not a lot of time, but I had learned in a soundproofed closet across 4 years that the right moment does not need to be long. It just needs to land first. The story ran on Thursday at 7 a.m. By 9 a.m., it had been shared inside 3 major institutional investment firms that I knew of, and probably several I didn't. By noon, the Tren family's legal team had sent a letter to the publication. The letter was careful, measured. It did not claim anything in the story was false. It asked for a correction on 2 minor factual details that were not minor. Changing them would have shifted the framing of the entire story without technically altering any stated fact. The publication's editorial team sat with the letter for 4 hours. Then they published a response, noting that both details had been independently verified by multiple sources and would not be corrected. The Tren family launched on Friday as planned. The press materials were professional. The track record claims were accurate. The methodology description was precise, but the story had already run, and the people reading the launch materials were reading them as people who had already felt the true version of this situation, who had already sat with Jin Rao's account of what it felt like to be squeezed by a 14-month-old piece of leverage until you gave something you had spent a decade building, who had already understood what Lena Park's 1 out of 3 meant about how the system was actually being used. The launch did not land the way it had been planned to land, not because anyone argued against it, because the frame had already been set, and the frame was the one I had built. The true one, the one with the breath in it, the hesitation, the moment of deciding visible instead of edited out. Take 19, not 22. 3 weeks after the launch, the Tren family's legal team made contact with Voss's organization directly. Not aggressively, quietly. The kind of contact that precedes a conversation about terms. I was not in that conversation. Voss handled it himself, which felt correct. Some rooms have a specific person in them, and it was not me. What I knew was the outcome. The terms included a discontinuation of the narrative campaign against Voss's organization, a licensing arrangement for elements of the pipeline architecture that Lena Park had developed, compensation that went to her directly, not to the Tren family, and a formal acknowledgement in a document that would never be public that the methodology behind both systems had a common origin. Jin Rao got nothing formally. What he got was a call from Voss, which lasted 40 minutes, the content of which I was not told and did not ask about. What I knew was that after the call, Jin Rao's name reappeared in the internal directory of Voss's organization, listed as a senior external advisor. Quiet. No announcement. Just there. Lena Park did not come back. She sent me a message 3 days after the terms were agreed. It said, "The pension fund thing still bothers me. I don't think I'm done trying to figure out what the right use of a system like this actually is. But thank you for making the call." I wrote back, "You're not supposed to know what the right use is before you've seen the wrong one." She replied with a single thumbs up, which reminded me immediately of Yuna, which I appreciated more than I would have been able to explain to either of them if either of them had ever been in the same room at the same time to ask. I called my father on Sunday, 7 p.m. He picked up, and before he could say anything about Uncle Daho, I said, "Dad, I think I figured something out." A pause. "The logistics thing," he said carefully. "No, the other thing. The one I called you about a few weeks ago." Another pause. I could hear him in his chair, the specific creak of it that I had been hearing on Sunday phone calls for 4 years. "Good figured out or complicated figured out," he said. I thought about 27 pages published on a Thursday, about a woman stepping aside from an entrance, about Voss at his window every morning, like a man checking on something. Jin Rao on the phone with his tired, careful voice. Lena Park and the breath she hadn't meant to let out. About 4 years in a soundproofed closet, learning the exact weight of the space before a line lands, not knowing what I was learning it for. Both, I said, at the same time. He made the sound he made when something confirmed something he had already suspected. "You eating real food? Sio feeds me." "Who is Sio?" "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but she has excellent judgment about food and I've decided that's enough." A pause, then quieter. "Are you okay, Kai?" I looked at the city outside the aggressive windows, the diagram of it, the tiny pieces moving, each one a decision being made by someone who thinks they are making it freely. Maybe they are. Maybe the decisions they make are the ones they were always going to make given who they are and what they've built and what they've learned to hear in the space before a line arrives. I had spent 4 years in a recording booth learning to hear exactly that space. The weight of it, the texture, the difference between a hesitation that's true and one that's performed. And then someone had needed exactly that, at exactly the moment I had needed to be needed, and the whole improbable sequence had clicked into place the way a key turns in a lock that was made exactly for it. "Yeah," I said. "I think I actually am." He made the sound again. Then, "I told your mother you'd be fine. She'll want to know about the food situation." "Tell her CO handles it." "She'll have questions about CO." "Tell her CO is very competent and we're not having that conversation." He laughed, which I had not heard on a Sunday phone call in approximately 2 years. It was a good sound. The kind of sound that meant something had shifted back to where it was supposed to be. I stayed at the window for a while after the call, not thinking about the Tren family, not thinking about the terms or the licensing arrangement or the quiet return of Jin Rao's name to the directory, not thinking about terms or timelines or counter-narratives, just looking at the city, the actual version of it, not the diagram, the one with people in it making decisions. Somewhere down there, Ryu was probably eating a convenience store sandwich at midnight and complaining about a timing issue in a scene that was almost right, but not quite. Somewhere down there, the Blue Reel studio was still running. I had made sure of that, quietly, through an arrangement that Voss had facilitated without my asking him to, which was the closest thing to a gift I had seen him give. The lights were still on. The microphones were still working. And somewhere, in that soundproofed closet, someone was running takes and listening for the one that was actually alive. I had spent 4 years learning something and not knowing what it was for. Then someone had shown me what it was for, and it had turned out to be exactly the thing I'd always been doing, just at a different scale, and with different stakes, and in a building with no name. In a part of the city I'd never had a reason to visit before. The feeling when a scene locks in is not loud, it's not dramatic, it just fits, and when it fits, there is nothing else in the world that feels exactly like that. I turned from the window. There was more work. There was always more work, which was not a complaint. It was the specific kind of not complaint that people make when they have found the work that is actually theirs. Marcus Vane had asked me once if I was ready to help build the most important story anyone had ever told. I had said, "When do I start?" He had said, "You already have." He was right, but not for the reason he thought. The most important story was not the one I placed in that publication on a Thursday morning. The most important story was the one that had been building for 4 years in a converted apartment that smelled like old carpet and recording foam, with 3 microphones and 1 soundproofed closet and a voice actor who ate convenience store sandwiches and told me with complete accuracy that it could go either way on any given Tuesday. That story was already told. It just took me a while to understand it had been a story at all. Take 19. Always. Not because it's the clean one, because it's the true one, and that has always been the only version worth sending out into the world.